So when I was first told the topic of this TEDx event was journey, my mind immediately flashed to all the journeys that I'd taken whilst in Zambia working for PEPAIDS. Particularly my journey to work, which, to be perfectly honest with you, wasn't always that fun. Every day usually began with a trip on a 15-seater minibus. A 15-seater minibus filled with 30 people and 2 goats and a cockerel and bags of cement and tubs of maize and a mattress. And sometimes there were even fish swinging from the wing mirrors. And after about 3 hours, if I was lucky enough to make it to my destination, provided that the bus hadn't broken down or fallen apart on the way, it wasn't over. I then had to get onto the back of a motorbike and travel at least another 10 kilometres into the bush to get to the village that I was going to be working in that day. Now, the motorbike journeys came with their own set of issues. Believe it or not, that river that you see there is actually supposed to be the road. Now, I tried to remain optimistic and, hope for the best. But not everybody on that particular journey felt that way. So then I started thinking, how did I get there? How did I end up working in rural villages in the southern province of Zambia for 3 years? And more importantly, why? Why was it that despite the inconveniences, the washed out roads, the snakes and the scorpions, the cars trapped on tree trunks, yes, it actually did happen, the unscrupulous bus drivers and the chickens that somehow always seemed to love to poo in my hair, why was it that in spite of those things, I still woke up every day, happy to be taking that journey? And really, it all started with some advice from my mum. Now, I'm not trying to be cheesy and say that my mum is the oracle and that she hands down wisdom like some sort of Sri Lankan Yoda, even though my dad does look a bit like him. She's also given me some ridiculous advice, like not cutting my toenails at night because it's bad luck, apparently, and not holding an umbrella over my head inside the house because I wouldn't grow, although in hindsight, she might have had a point there. But the one piece of advice that she's given me that has stuck in my head ever since I was a kid is her saying that knowledge is power. And it was a saying that she'd repeat at any point, whether she was doing the cooking or teaching me my times tables. Both my parents really believed in the importance of a good education, and they always said that it should be one of my main priorities. They saw education and knowledge as tools through which I could ensure myself a better future. Now, I never really understood the true impact of my mum's favourite quote until I first visited Zambia as a volunteer for the charity peer education programme against AIDS, or PEPAIDS. What really hit me really quite hard was not actually the fact that knowledge is power, but how a lack of knowledge can actually make you powerless. So think of it like this. Imagine that you're sitting a maths exam. Now imagine that you've never been taught how to add up, you've never been taught how to subtract, how to multiply, how to divide. That would make things pretty difficult, wouldn't it? Maybe even impossible? But to be honest, and you're never really going to hear this in a school, it's not like it's a matter of life or death. But what if it was? So I want you to imagine that instead of a maths exam, you're faced with a situation in which you could possibly contract HIV. Imagine that the information that you need to help you make the right decision at the right time just isn't available. That the education that you needed to protect yourself just wasn't there. And that this time, your whole life could be affected by the choice that you decide to make. In that scenario, the common things that are missing are vital knowledge and education. In Zambia, that scenario isn't hypothetical. It's the day-to-day reality. I really believe that in 2014, almost 35 years after the first reported cases of HIV and AIDS, accurate information about the disease should be as widespread as knowing how to count to 10. In Zambia, you are either infected or affected by HIV and AIDS, and in the absence of a cure, education is the closest thing that we have to a vaccine. Education is therefore the key element in the fight against HIV and AIDS in Africa. In 2010, when I first went to Zambia as a volunteer and a worker for PEP-AIDS through the Vodafone World of Difference programme, the life expectancy index rating for the country was the second lowest in the world. A lack of education surrounding the issues to do with HIV and AIDS, combined with extreme poverty, particularly in the rural areas of the southern province, had resulted in the country being basically the worst hit, one of the worst hit by the virus. 17% of 15 to 49-year-olds were living with the disease. That's 1 in 6 people. Furthermore, the country actually had the lowest levels of under 5 mortality. There was 1 in 5 in terms of under 5 mortality amongst the least educated and poorest mothers. So what are we talking about in terms of education? Because people will say, well, there's medicine for that now. And it's true. People can live a lot longer with the new effective treatments. But it's not a panacea. Just think about this. For every person that began effective anti-HIV treatment in 2006, 6 new people became infected. Treatment will help them, but education would stop them from getting infected in the first place. So what do we mean by education? Do we mean access to good quality formal education in a classroom setting? Do we mean sex and relationships education, focusing on how the virus is transmitted and looking at how this can be prevented in a way that's culturally appropriate? Or is it arming people with the skills that they need to generate an income to get themselves out of poverty? Well, the simple answer is that actually it's all 3. So let's take the first example. Why is access to good quality formal education important? Well, for one thing, the slides are pretty fast. For one thing, it's been proven that educated girls are more likely to know how to prevent HIV infection, to delay sex, and to take measures to protect themselves. In Zambia, there's supposed to be an education for all policy. But as so often happens, the provision just doesn't match the promise. Many pupils find themselves excluded from government schools because they're just too far away or they're just difficult to access. In one of the communities that we worked in, the children couldn't walk to the nearest government school because they couldn't cross the river, and there were instances where some of the children were actually washed away. There are also hidden fees that parents just can't afford for things like uniforms. And finally, there's just not enough places. Contrary to what Zambian bus drivers seem to believe, there's only so many people you can fit into a small space. So what these communities do in order to provide some sort of education for their children, they set up their own schools, known as, wait for it, community schools. Now, in some respects, this is just a tremendous achievement. These communities are so passionate about their children having an education that they set up their own schools and in some cases build them with their own hands for them. In the UK, you're sometimes lucky enough if you get some parents to see the inside of a school, let alone build one from scratch. In spite of this determination and passion, community schools face some very serious problems. The United Nations Development Programme reported in 2009 that 2/3 of Zambians were living on less than $1.25 a day, a fact that has serious implications for these community schools. Because they receive little or no funding from the government, they are basically built in makeshift structures made out of thatch, clay brick and wood. They have 0 classroom resources and they're run by just regular people who have no teacher training whatsoever. The most shocking thing about these schools is that they actually make up 30% of the overall schools in Zambia, catering for 500,000 children. Now, when you think about that fact, it's quite harrowing. Education, as we've heard already, has the potential to be a lifeline out of poverty, and it can actually protect people from disease. But it can't when the poorest people are still receiving the poorest education. When you look at a classroom like this one, the most immediately striking thing is the level of poverty. And your natural instinct is that you want to give them things, lots of things. But this is one instance where actually giving skills and training is far more valuable than giving material resources. So when our education project, the Schools of Good Hope programme, started, it started off as a schools linking programme aimed at raising funds to buy resources for these schools. But we soon realised after one classroom observation that it didn't matter how many pens or pencils or books we gave them. If the teachers weren't trained or weren't competent, the standard of education in the schools was never going to change. So we shifted our focus to instead start looking at capacity building the teachers through teacher training. Over the next 2 years, we wrote, gained ministry approval for, and delivered a syllabus of teacher training across 7 schools in Zambia, catering to 1,200 children. Basically, we took these local volunteers who were so passionate about education, they'd set up their own school, and then gave them the basic teacher training that they'd never be able to afford, covering things like lesson planning, group work, pupil engagement and assessment. We also phased out the use of corporal punishment in our schools. And we also gave them tips and hints on how to make their lessons more engaging, using bottle tops and sacks, so using locally available resources. So what was the impact? Well, this is Chester. He is one of the teachers at Kafefwe, the school that I showed you before. At the beginning of the 2 years, Chester was just a local guy. He had received no teacher training whatsoever, had never seen a syllabus in his life, and was standing in a classroom teaching what he knew in this classroom made out of thatch. 2 months before our teacher training programme ended, Chester's class took exams, and they actually achieved better grades than the students in the nearest government school. The same thing happened in 2 of our other schools as well. This is the perfect illustration that it's not about what you have, it's what you know that can make all the difference. Training these teachers to the level where they could offer their children the kind of education that was of similar quality to that offered in government schools allowed these communities to take one step forward to levelling the playing field. By giving future generations the opportunity to break the cycle of poverty that often goes hand in hand with the infection, we're giving them a massive chance. Education is a vaccine. The same principle actually applies to sex and relationships education. In the early days of the AIDS crisis in Zambia, people literally threw condoms at the affected communities or encouraged them to abstain. I know what'll stop AIDS. Tell them to all stop having sex. That'll work. This is the perfect example, again, of the difference between what you have and what you know. Just because communities had access to condoms didn't mean that they were going to use them or know how to use them properly. As many men in the communities would say to me, well, you wouldn't eat a sweet with the wrapper on, so why would you use a condom? The problem with this approach is that it's a solution in a bubble. It doesn't take into account the cultural beliefs or social pressures that people are facing that basically makes them at risk. Women and girls in Zambia are particularly disproportionately affected by HIV and AIDS, with young women aged 15 to 24 being 4 times more likely than their male counterparts to be infected. The gender inequalities within Zambian society actually make it very difficult for women to say no to sex or to negotiate condom use. Now, obviously, discussing these issues in the communities was always going to be a challenge, not just because of low literacy levels or the fact that the communities are quite traditionally private by nature, but because you're talking about sex. And talking about sex in front of your neighbours, your family and your relatives is not really what most of us would choose to do on an afternoon. But it's also no coincidence that tonight, if you type the letter E into the Google search bar, one of the top results that will come out after eBay is Ebola. In the face of an epidemic, the hunger for education overrules embarrassment. So what do? Well, we set up a project called Staging Change, and we worked with 4 communities. And over the course of 6 months, we explored issues like the myths and facts and misconceptions about HIV and AIDS, cultural perceptions of gender and sex, and the impact of the bride price. And we tried to be creative. As the name suggests, Staging Change is a project that's built around drama, and you've already heard from Chris about the power of drama. And I know some people like to turn their nose down at it, but for me, I've used drama in prisons with disaffected youth and with recovering drug addicts, and it's always been the tool for encouraging talk. We used activities like forum theatre, where audience members would step into a role play and take over the role of the main protagonist and basically try to solve a problem, to help community members basically develop strategies for dealing with everyday scenarios. We did things like this gender matrix, where we gave people cards with different attitudes, roles, behaviours and activities on them, and asked them to put them under either the headings of male, female or both. What you kind of end up with at the end of this exercise is quite a stark representation of how women in particular are vulnerable on a number of different levels in the communities due to gender inequality. You know, things like no say, can't choose when to have sex, dependency. This guy over here is Nelson. And we had quite a big heated debate with Nelson about why he felt that it was only a woman's responsibility to go for HIV testing. The community debated this amongst themselves for about half an hour. You know, why did men think they didn't have to go for HIV testing? Why were women always the ones that were blamed for bringing disease into their marriages, even though men were more promiscuous? Why was it a woman's responsibility to take care of her health? In the end, the whole community, including Nelson, decided that actually it was everybody's responsibility to get tested. Importantly, at no point did I ever say what they should think. I just provided them with the information and the methodologies through which they could examine their own beliefs. And that is how it works. That's how education is a vaccine. Exercises like this basically give people the chance to re-examine their own cultural and social beliefs and look at them critically in the light of HIV and AIDS. What you think shouldn't even really come into it. If behaviour change is actually going to happen, people need to come to it themselves. And it worked. So, to prevent the spread of HIV in these communities, what we were trying to do was make the relationships between men and women more equitable. And to give you an idea of some of the changes, the quantitative data that we took at the end of the project showed that the number of people who thought that a woman deserved to be blamed for being raped had reduced. The number of people who thought that a woman deserved to be beaten had reduced. The number of people who thought that men should be the main decision maker in the household had reduced. The number of people that were demonstrating increased knowledge and awareness around HIV and AIDS increased. Participants continued to report positive changes even 4 months after the project was finished. So what about education and income? What has having a sustainable income got to do with it? Why is it important? Well, I've never been a believer that money makes the world go round, but what it does do is it gives you options. And when you don't have options and you can't feed yourself, you can't feed your family, you can't provide for them, people start to get desperate. And desperate people, it's not just a cliche, desperate people take desperate measures. When I first went to Zambia, I met this group of women called the Lusampoko Women's Group. And they told me how all of them at some point in their lives had resorted to prostitution because they couldn't find another way to earn an income or to provide for themselves. They told me a story about how recently a 13-year-old girl had been raped by a 70-year-old man for the equivalent of 20 Zambian kwacha. That is 15 ringgit. The man had been arrested, but the girl was now pregnant and she needed treatment for a sexually transmitted infection. Extreme poverty causes people to make awful and difficult choices. They told me about how mothers would often send their eldest girl child to collect food from an older man, knowing full well that this would come at a price, a devastating price, but they didn't know how else to provide for their families. Knowing how to earn an income and make it sustainable doesn't come naturally, and these women were neither educated nor literate. But we taught them how to tie and dye clothing, we taught them how to make peanut butter, and they learned how to market and sell these products. Once they started selling these products, they started to generate a sustainable income, and they could provide for themselves, they could feed their families. And that wasn't the end of it. they started to use the profits from this sustainable income and they bought chickens. And then they started selling the eggs. And the profits from the eggs they used to take care of the AIDS orphans in their communities. So now, when these women engage in a transaction, they're selling their products and not their bodies. At the outset of this journey, I told you that education is a vaccine. But it doesn't matter how powerful your vaccine is if nobody ever receives it, if it sits in a drawer somewhere and nobody ever gets it. The power of a vaccine is really dependent on how widely it is spread. And this is where you come in. Go out there and see these people, work with them, volunteer your skills. Everybody has something to offer. If you find a charity that prioritizes education, support it. Epidemics spread quickly, but ideas spread quicker. Your journey starts here. Thank you.